I call Ian McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak on the Geographical Indicators Wines and Spirits Amendment Bill, and hence the reason why we are dealing with wines and spirits here and not sheep meat and all sorts of other things, but I'll get onto that a little later. Mr Speaker, isn't it nice to be talking about some positive legislation? Legislation that adds value for an industry on the move, an industry that last year produced $1.6 billion worth of income for the New Zealand economy, growing at a rate of about 10% a year, which is pretty significant. It's also a really interesting example of how regional fortunes change around New Zealand. And if you remember, those who remember the Marlborough Plains of sort of 30 years ago, which were pretty rocky and if they didn't have water on them were brown, same colour as this house at all times. Now when you fly over the Marlborough Plains, they're completely different and producing a good deal of the $1.6 billion worth of wine that leaves New Zealand every year. Pretty amazing performance, really, and you can see the same things happening in Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Central Otago and other parts of New Zealand. This bill originally arose out of or as a result of an obligation under the WTO Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. These oblige New Zealand effectively to provide protection for geographical indicators. And a geographical indicator indicates that a wine or spirit comes from a particular region, and I guess two that come to mind very readily internationally are Scotch whisky and champagne. Of course, in New Zealand we have, as the previous speaker alluded to, many other, I guess, geographical indicators that will be picked up in the course of the development of this legislation, or as a result of the development of this legislation. And whilst I have 3 wine growers in the Rangitikei electorate, I find it highly unlikely that we'll have a Rangitikei wine registered. But just to touch on the point that the last speaker made, and of course the other thing about it is that it is quite a speaking about wine at this time of the day is quite dangerous for us laymen, because they always say that if you think about it at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're in trouble by 6. But I want, Mr Speaker, to speak very briefly about a topic that the last speaker touched on, because I think it's equally important. You know, and if you think about the Rangitikei, for example, maybe one day we will see Rangitikei lamb registered as a geographical indicator. And I think it raises a very good point, which was part of quite a lengthy discussion we had in the Select Committee on this very topic. Of course, this piece of legislation is specific to wines and spirits, and it is an amendment of a bill that was put in place in 2006 but never implemented. And so that's why we haven't dealt with the other topics or with the other points around geographical indicators in the course of this discussion. I'm sure, as the last speaker said, this will be an issue that comes back before a Select Committee of the future, and I hope reasonably quickly, because I think, again, if you refer to the Pāmu brand, which Damien O'Connor spoke about, that we visited last night, that type of branding is changing the world very quickly, and Lewis Road Creamery is a good example of that type of branding that I think is going to be hugely that's going to be hugely, certainly not, that's going to hugely be important for the future of New Zealand's exports, because the days of us exporting bulk commodities are long gone, and whilst we're still going to rely on that type of export to some extent, it certainly needs to change, and this is a way it will change. We received some 38 submissions on this bill, pretty much all of them agreeing with the bill. And I just want to touch on a couple of other things the bill deals with, because they did engender some interesting discussion. It contains what's called opposition procedures, which I would have thought was anyone can protest the thing if they don't like it. But opposition procedures, which clearly is a term, or I guess a legal term we use to describe how you oppose something, it allows an interested person to protest, I guess, or oppose the registration of a geographical indicator, and an interested person is defined in the Act, so there's no issue with that. It also allows for objection on cultural lines, and we can be confident that this cannot be abused, as it did create quite some considerable discussion around the Select Committee table from one particular member. But these conditions mirror a provision in the Trademark Act, which has been long enforced and have never really been challenged. So I think that we can be assured that those type of provisions, from our perspective, are going to create the right or the right impact. They're not going to cause any problem, I don't think. And so So, Mr Speaker, I want to thank the Select Committee for some quite interesting discussion. We, with a bit of luck, we'll have got most of our this morning's Select Committee discussion out of the way in the House here this morning before we get to the Select Committee, so we'll have a much quicker Select Committee than usual, because the discussion that the opposition have raised already this morning is one we have every time we have a Select Committee meeting, and no doubt it'll come back again. But, Mr Speaker, I want to thank them for the great bit of work they've done on this piece of legislation. I also want to congratulate Minister Goldsmith on getting this to the post and for choosing the Primary Production Select Committee to deal with it, for being so enthusiastic about this bill that he was even seen last night with it wearing a geographical indicator of his own on his shirt. Mr Speaker, I've got a great deal of pleasure in commending this bill to the House for further discussion in the committee stage. Thank you.